I'm Dick Smith. Most Australians would know me because I own Dick Smith Electronics. But to people overseas, I won the lottery of life. I was born in Australia in the 1940s, so I've never had to go to war. And this is a great country for basically any type of adventure. And my greatest adventure was opening a little electronics company called Dick Smith Electronics. I had $610. I was about 1968, I was 24 years of age, and I started a company originally fixing two-way radios because I was a ham radio operator, my only qualification. And one day I went into George Street in Sydney, I live in Sydney, and I went to buy some components to fix the two-way radios. And the service was so bad, I thought, oh, maybe I could start off in selling components. That's what I did, and about 15 years later I sold the business for over $20 million, and I was still only 36 or 37 years of age. But that's where I'm well known in Australia because of Dick Smith Electronics. My interest in electronics as a child, in fact we called it radio in those days, and it's a very fascinating story because when I was a young boy, my grandfather, who is still alive, was called Harold Casno, and Harold Casno is a famous pictorial photographer of the 20s and 30s. And I used to go over, he lived opposite where I lived as a kid, and I'd go over to the Casno house, and if I was a good boy, and I was 5 or 6 years of age, they'd give me the key to Harold's room. And Harold's room was a room set up with the most wonderful radio equipment. Harold Casno Jr. had gone to the Second World War and he was killed in Tobruk. And the parents were devastated. They had 5 daughters, one of them being my mother, and this one son, and he was killed. So they left his room, which had his bed on one side and all of his radio equipment. He was a radio genius. And they would let me into that room, and that's what gave me an interest in radio. And I remember I was about 8 years of age when I built my first crystal set. Had no money. My parents, dad was a salesman, mum was a housewife, no money at all. I was given an old dynamic microphone which someone said would work as an earphone. And I had a couple of diodes, and in those days I think an old capacitor, tuning capacitor from a old valve radio, a coil, and I made it all up and I got it all set up at my home, and I listened and listened, and I said I could hear bagpipes, and I remember my parents listened, they couldn't hear anything. Luckily my sister, who was 2 years older, she could hear bagpipes. I was so excited I knocked a cup of tea right over the hall table and the wall. My parents weren't very happy about that. But from that very first crystal set, I loved radio. I have no qualifications, I was never any good academically. I had a speech defect when I was young. I also, these days you'd say that I was probably slightly dyslexic. I had problems in learning, but practical things like radio I loved. So I loved building crystal sets, fixing radios, and I loved the out of doors. In the end, I ended up with Dick Smith Electronics, which was based on radio, and that was because I went to get a job as a park ranger because I love the out of doors, and they said, oh, you need a degree, you need qualifications, and so that ruled that out. So I had to go back to electronics. People often ask me what was my inspiration for electronics. Look, I was interested in everything. I'm a very practical person. So in those days, I remember I was a magician. I used to go to parties as a magician. I built model aeroplanes. I loved radio and I fiddled with radio. Basically, I remember once building a hectograph, these were the days before copying machines. And I read in a magazine called Hobbies Illustrated that you could get some glycerine from the chemist, melt it and put it on a pad, and then you could write on a bit of paper in this quite good ink and then lie it on the hectograph, and then you could print from it. I remember that clearly because as I was boiling the wax for the hectograph, it caught a light. And so I took it from the stove across to the sink and turned the tap on. Now anyone tells you if you've got a glycerine and orthol, never put water in it. The whole thing exploded, it went right up, it completely singed the whole ceiling of the kitchen. It singed all my eyebrows off, and when my mother came home they had to get the kitchen repainted. I was lucky to live, but it just went whoosh and then luckily went out. So that was the story with my hectograph. So I loved anything that was using my hands. I was no good academically, but I loved fixing radios, building planes, doing anything like that. And I think I gradually moved into radio because that was what was changing all the time. Radio turned into electronics. Things that I'd never believed you could have a little walkie-talkie. I'd seen these old World War II valve, or tube, as the Americans call them, walkie-talkies. And then one day we started getting smaller and smaller walkie-talkies. I remember the first transistor. It was called an OC71. And I saw it in Radio and Hobbies magazine, and it was £3.17 and sixpence. So, over $7 today. Now one semiconductor can be bought for 20 cents sort of thing. And I remember buying that transistor and making a one transistor radio. Of course, the question is, where did I learn about electronics? And most people go to tech or university. I basically was self-taught. I used to get, in those days, Radio and Hobbies magazine. Then it was called Radio and Television Hobbies, and then it moved to Electronics Australia. Now it's sort of Silicon Chip. But I would get those magazines and I'd read them. And actually, I've never really been, I must admit, that good academically. And so I learnt my radio pretty well self-taught, reading magazines. I did enrol for 1 year at the Electronics and Communications Certificate course at the Gore Hill Tech, but it was actually beyond me, the mathematics. But I did learn about a Fermi layer and how a transistor operated and a few things like that. Essentially, I'm practical. I've always had a very good practical knowledge of radio. And what you must remember, back in the 50s when I was a kid, you could actually have a general knowledge of everything in radio. Communications, radar, you could understand it all. These days, of course, you can't. If you're a specialist in communications and cell phones, there's a good chance you'll know nothing about how a DVD player or a CD works. It's also specialised. It's different today. I had no money when I was a kid, so I used to get bits and pieces. People would loan me or give me bits and pieces of radios, old valve radios, and I would make them into something. And then I used to always have a job. From the age of about 9 or 10, I had to work so I could buy electronic components, or radio components as we called them. And I remember when I was about 10 years of age, Radio and Hobbies magazine came out with a 4-page Price's Radio catalogue. And this is important because I ended up introducing the first large catalogues in electronics magazines. But I loved this catalogue. It was just descriptions, no photos, and prices. And I used to get my dad to go into Price's Radio, which was in Angel Place in Sydney, and he'd buy the components for me after I'd saved up. I was sold newspapers, I delivered for the chemist, I fixed, when I got a bit more knowledge, my dad printed a little card that said, "Dick Smith can fix your mantle radio." And I put it around in people's letterboxes. And that made good money. And then I went from there to basically getting a full-time job, initially in a factory. In 1962, when I first started to work, we actually manufactured in Australia. Imagine that. And so I worked for initially Weston Electronics, that made two-way radios for taxi cabs and for the Royal Flying Doctor Service. My first job, I was sitting in the back bench of a factory winding coils for the LM18 HF transceiver. I'd love to get one of those transceivers. They must be around in junk shops. And then I went and worked for Murray Findlay of Findlay Communications. Now the interesting thing was, when I built my first crystal set, it was designed by Murray Findlay of Radio and Hobbies. Well, this must have been 10 years later. He'd opened up his own business making two-way radios, and I went to work for him, and he's been a firm friend ever since. In the 1950s, it's interesting, there was a lot of interest in radio in those days. There was a very thriving ham radio network. My only qualification is a ham radio licence, and I got my ham radio licence, I think, when I was 16. And I was very proud to do that. The call sign was VK2ZIP, VK2ZIP, because I could never master the Morse code. I've always had difficulty in learning things. I got the Morse code later, just before I flew around the world solo in the helicopter, because I wanted to use ham radio as my sort of safety net. But back in those days, there was lots of ham radio operators. There were radio shops. Disposal stores were very popular, where all the old military equipment from the Second World War was being sold 10, 15 years later, and that's where you used to buy things. And so it wasn't really called electronics, it was called radio. I built myself a noughts and crosses computer that would play noughts and crosses. It was not electronic, it was built out of telephone relays and uniselectors, and I managed to get old rectifiers. I think they came from an old disposal store, so I could convert the AC into DC. And I built a noughts and crosses computer in those days, in the 1950s, that could actually play noughts and crosses, and you could never win against it. Back in the 1950s, there was a definite movement. In fact, it had started in the 1930s, I understand. Incredible interest in radio electronics, and people would build their own radios. And then, of course, in the 40s, it started to expand in 50s, and it's really gone ever since then. The difference today is, of course, with microprocessors and with digital techniques, you tend to buy most stuff. It's very hard to, say, build an iPod from scratch. You can't go to the Dick Smith shop and buy the components and get out the soldering iron and build it. That would be impossible. In my day, can you imagine, there was no such thing as a transistor, and one day the magazine comes out, I remember it mentioned in the Bell Labs they'd invented this thing called a transistor. About 2 years later, an article came out that you could buy a transistor and use it. It was horrendously expensive. One day I was in the school bus coming home, and this person had this tiny little box with music coming out of it. And I said, "Oh, is that a transistor radio?" And he said, "How do you know?" And he'd got one from America, one of the very first transistor radios, when Australians, the smallest radio was a great big thing with big batteries in it and valves. And I'd read about it in an electronics magazine, and here it was existing. Now, of course, a little transistor radio, well, they cost about $10, and everyone has one. Back in those days, it was the reason people built kits to save money. It may have been, but electronics back then, or radio, was a lot more expensive compared to your average wage than it is today. Electronics is one of the things which has dropped dramatically in price. And I used to skimp and save to buy one transistor at £3.17 and sixpence. Imagine that. Over $7, and that's when the average wage was probably $30 or $40 a week. And so to me, you know, I get the feeling that a lot more was built in those days. And I know with amateur radio, I mean, the difference these days is you can buy a beautiful rig, or you can get on the internet, or you can get, I don't know if you've seen, but there are these amazing little things called cell phones. You can talk around the world with it. I mean, it's magic. Now, in my day, if we put a taxi cab radio transmitter on a hill, we had another transmitter nearby. To stop them from interfering with each other, we had a great big cavity resonator. And it was a great big sort of metal tube, and that was the only way we could get it to work. Now you have a cell phone that transmits and receives on multiple different frequencies. You can sit them beside each other, they don't even affect each other. I mean, electronics has just come so many bounds, I can't even understand how it can work. Back before my time, lots of people built their own mantle radios, but in the 1950s there was this huge manufacturing industry in Australia. There was total protection. For example, it wasn't just 20 or 30% duty, there were lump sums. If I remember rightly, it was something like $1.50 or $2 on each semiconductor, each transistor, lump sum. So that meant virtually everything was manufactured in Australia. We had Astor, AWA, I used to go to the AWA factory. They made speakers. I remember seeing them making the actual fibre, getting the fibre in for the speaker cone. They made valves, they made transistors. Everything was made here. Quite fantastic. And so things were a lot more expensive, but there was a manufacturing industry. When I started Dick Smith Electronics in 1968, most of what I sold was manufactured here. Transformers were manufactured here. Of course, Gough Whitlam got in, and then he reduced the duty, and everything started to be imported. And I did very well out of that, because I decided, well, I always loved electronics. Wouldn't it be great if you could buy the components cheaper? So I started importing. There was a huge change when Gough Whitlam got in and reduced the lump sum tariffs. It's interesting, he was a Labor government. You'd think they'd be protecting the unions and the workers. But he made this decision, which I think was sensible and right. It's a globalised world. You should do what you're good at. I think in Australia we're great at growing food. We grow the best food in the world. We should specialise in what we're good at, food, whereas making electronics, Asia's been best at that, and so we should let them specialise. Watches, Switzerland's best at that. Each country should specialise. But yes, Gough Whitlam made this change, and it revolutionised the whole of electronics. First of all, it meant that ham radio operators didn't have to build everything. They could buy equipment, which is a pity in one way, but great in other ways. It brought the cost down dramatically, so people could afford a TV set. I remember our first TV set, I think, was £250 when I was a kid. $500, and this is back when that'd be equivalent to probably $5,000 or $6,000 for one TV set today that you can buy for $300. So the change was absolutely staggering. It wasn't just the fact that we removed the tariffs. and that you could use cheaper labour. It was the fact that electronics moved ahead so quickly in design. But people say, was it a quality issue that we couldn't compete? Initially it was mainly just a cost of labour issue, that Japan was the leading supplier, the cost of labour was way less. Now at the moment I think there's about 60 yen to an Australian dollar. When I started buying from Japan, there was 425 yen to the dollar. So that means things were about 6 times cheaper because of the exchange rate, let alone that the salaries and wages in Japan were so much lower. So it was something like 1/10 the price you could buy something for. That meant we could sell it for 1/10 as much, and that really meant the electronics industry could boom here because the specialist manufacturers could buy the components so much cheaper. In my early days, we made capacitors, we made resistors. Everything was made here. Virtually nothing was imported. That's all changed now to where virtually everything is imported. By the way, that'll change as the standard of living and the wages rise in countries like China and India. We'll become competitive again, and you'll find that we'll be starting to manufacture here again. When I started Dick Smith Electronics, I manufactured selective calling equipment, so you could selectively call a two-way radio. I also manufactured an inexpensive power supply for two-way radios. And I did that for about 2 or 3 years and realised that it was better to import and let the cheap labour companies do the manufacturing of sort of intricate equipment. And I've always supported that. I've said, we're great at growing food, we should be the leaders in growing food in the world. We're great at minerals, we should be leaders at that. When it comes to intricate work, employing thousands of people with little soldering irons, let countries who are better than that. But of course it will all change as their standard of living rises. One day we'll be competitive again and we'll be manufacturing a lot more. What's happening of course now is it's not just labour rates, but it's automation. And I couldn't have believed, when I worked for Findlay Communications, it would have been about 1964, I actually used to wire the radio sets. It was called an 8A11, a two-way radio. Had about 11 valves, if I remember correctly, and it had a metal chassis, the valve sockets. I always remember one of my first jobs was the valve sockets never fitted exactly the punching. I don't know why. So you'd have to get out an Abra file. Do they still have Abra files? Yeah, I think they do. And you'd file the little holes so they were in conjunction with the valve socket, then you get out your pop rivet gun. Then I would wire the complete set. Talk about automation, there was none. So I'd wire the set with a soldering iron and then quite often align it and check it and see that it was working. Now these days, most things are built into large-scale microprocessor integrated circuit and it's done by machinery. I can't believe that some of the automation today, you think, how could that work? But it not only works, it means the reliability is so much greater. Back in the 1950s when I was a kid, it was a lot harder to buy electronic components. There was a number of radio wholesalers, they called them, and they used to basically sell to the trade, but if you were pretty astute you could get in and buy from them. And then there were some retailers. In Sydney we had people like Price's Radio, we had Radio House, and that's where you'd buy. In Melbourne they had General Accessories, and in the electronics magazines or radio magazines, Radio and Hobbies, you'd have ads and you'd quite often buy, they didn't call it really mail order, but you'd sort of buy by mail order. So it was harder to get components. I revolutionised the whole field because I opened the first self-service type store. You used to have to stand behind a counter and wait up to half an hour to get served. And at famous George Brown's, the electrical wholesalers in Sydney, there'd be fist fights behind the counter because people would say, you're being served in front of me. And you'd say, can I have 1 1/4 watt 22 ohm resistor? So the bloke would then wander out the back and disappear for about half an hour, come back with 1 resistor. Then he'd write it on the docket and it would be 1 resistor, 12 cents, plus 27.5% sales tax. Remember, this was before electronic calculators, they didn't exist. I can't remember how he'd probably get out a slide rule to work out the tax and work that out. And so you'd take an hour to buy 10 minutes worth of goods. I revolutionised it because I said, we're just going to have self-service. I remember it was about 1971 or something. I wound down the shutter at Gore Hill of my two-way radio and car radio installation business. I said, no, that's too hard work lying under dashboards installing radios. I'm going to sell electronics and I'm going to do it in a revolutionary way. And I covered the floor, had to clean up the grease with Hugo carpet tiles. Oh, they were the in thing. And I even put in piped music. The standard 600 ohm telephone line, you could get Muzak because in those days there were no such thing as DVDs or CDs or iPods, and the Muzak would come at $60 a month or something from the telephone exchange and coming from in town, and they'd pipe special music so your customers would be put in a mood to buy electronic components. And instead of having the resistors out the back and the P1 plugs, I had them all in bins, and you just pick them up yourself and you'd go and line up and pay. Now the amazing thing was that I said, when I changed the car radio premises into a self-service shop, I'm going to do $1 million a year in the first year. I did. And I used to go up to work on the Saturday morning, and I'd get there at 9 o'clock and there would be 100 people waiting to get in. It was so popular to have good service. Now, I just copied it. I'd looked on magazines from overseas and saw that Tandy in the United States was selling components that way, so I thought I'd copy them. One of the things I find fascinating is that I'll go along and I'll give a talk, and recently I went up to Optus, to their satellite station, and there's all these blokes sitting there, PhDs, their engineering qualifications, I'm looking up to them, and they're all sitting there looking up at me, and they're saying to me, Dick, we learnt through your Funway books, and I can't believe it because I've got no qualifications. I'd love to have them, but I'm not that bright. And to think that I had influence on so many people. I remember writing the Funway books. I knew that I wanted something really simple. Now, I thought the Funway books were for hobbyists, people like me. I couldn't believe that they would be used as the basis for some of our computer scientists, some of our radio engineers today, and it makes me feel very proud. From time to time I'll be walking, say, down the street in Melbourne, and someone will stop me and say, Dick, I just want to say hello. I'm now in electronics, I'm in rocket guidance, and I started off with your Funway books. Makes me feel very proud. Look, I've always had fun in business. If ever I wrote a business book, I'd call it Funway to a Fortune. And in those early days of Dick Smith Electronics, we just had so much fun. We did have the grab bag, but we had other things. If you look in our catalogues, I used to be driving around and I'd see people who had broken off their car radio aerial, and so they'd grab a coat hanger and put it in and have a bent coat hanger. So we put in, for $350 in our catalogue, we said, famous Dick Smith coat hanger aerial. And we said, you've seen them everywhere, but you've never known where to buy them. So we at Dick Smith Electronics have got into a special supply, and they're very cheap, only $350. The funny thing was that I went and got a cheque drawn on our company, but it was a bank cheque, so it just said bank cheque, and I sent it into the mail order department ordering a coat hanger aerial and with a phony address. Well, the staff came up to me and they said, look, someone's ordered a coat hanger aerial. And I said, oh, that's just a joke, the cheque will be phony. And they said, oh no, it's a bank cheque. Now, they didn't realise it was me buying it, so we didn't lose any money anyway. And I said, oh, people can't be that stupid. So then the rumour and the story went out all around Australia how people bought a coat hanger aerial. We also had things like energy-saving light globes, and they were an 80-watt light globe that was blown. We'd pre-blown it, so we said you could save 80 watts, and it was only $2.50 because, you'd save a fortune. Then we said, but if you really want to save a lot of money, buy a 100-watt pre-blown light globe. And we sold some of those, so we had a lot of fun. At the time, I remember with Dick Smith Electronics, people kept talking about towing icebergs from Antarctica to Australia, an arid country. So I announced that I was going to do it and cut up the ice and call it Dixicles for people's drinks. And I actually was never going to do it because I knew the iceberg would melt on the way. But April Fool's Day was coming up, and one of my more astute workers, Jerry Nolan, said, Dick, why don't we pull an April Fool's joke? And so we faked an iceberg out of a huge barge with firefighting foam and plastic sheeting. We towed it out on the night before April Fool's Day, and then on April Fool's Day morning, I had about 300 staff working for me. I gave them a list of all the radio, TV stations and the newspapers, and I said, you've got to get up at 5 a.m. in the morning and ring the radio station, ring these numbers and say, what's that coming in through Sydney Harbour Heads? It looks like an iceberg. Well, you can imagine all of the media, their switchboards just light up, they're jammed, so they think some catastrophe's happening. So it gets on the radio. In the end, we had thousands of people at the headlands watching this Dick Smith iceberg come in. When we got to the Opera House, we lifted the plastic and said it was an April Fool's joke. Now, amazingly enough, it appeared all around the world. And I was trying to get the Midland CB radio agency from America. And I went over a few weeks later and he said, Mr. Smith, this is the president of the company, he said, your iceberg appeared on the front page of the Chicago Tribune. If you can get that type of publicity from Australia, we'll give you the agency. So it was worth it. By the way, the whole iceberg stunt cost $1,200. So you can get free advertising. In those days I had no money, so I had to do the advertising very cheaply. I started Dick Smith Electronics with $610. That's the business that turns over billions of dollars a year today. I no longer own it. I'm very proud that it's still operating. Of course, it's moved now from electronic components more into large TV sets, which I understand it's owned by an Australian-owned public company, and I'm very proud that it still exists. But in the early days, I had no money. I'd saved up $600 and my fiance at the time had $10. So we started with $610. I remember we started at the Big Bear car park in Neutral Bay, which is a northern suburb of Sydney. Everyone had gone broke there. I didn't realise that. It was the time of Eric Anderson's and there'd been a huge credit squeeze and all these electronic companies would go broke. Now, it was good training for me because when I would ring up to try and buy components or radios or something from AWA or for Astor, they'd say, what's your name? And I'd say, Dick Smith. And that was bad enough, pretty common name. Oh, where's your business? And I said, at the Big Bear at Neutral Bay. Well, everyone had gone broke. So they wouldn't even take a cheque from me. I had to pay cash to buy from the trade. But that was really good training. It was absolutely fantastic. So in those early days with $610, I was able to expand the business. In the first year, my accountant said to me, Dick, you've made more money than the Prime Minister of Australia. And I said, how have I done that? In those days, Prime Minister got about $30,000 a year. And he said, well, look, you've increased your stock, you've done this, you've done that. And I've always been a very simple businessman. I had an exercise book and I would write down what the turnover was. I knew what the margin was. And right from the start, I did very well because I gave very good service. I managed to be a little bit less expensive than others, and I was very enthusiastic and I worked very hard. The reason that Dick Smith Electronics was successful and the reason that I've been successful as a businessman, there's a number of simple reasons. First of all, I've always been very happy to ask advice and copy the success of others. Originally, the catalogue I copied off Lafayette Radio in America. I'd seen it in an electronics magazine. So copy the success of others. The idea of the self-service electronics shop I copied from Tandy, or it was called Radio Shack in the United States. The catalogue was also copied off Henry Radio in England. I became friends with these people and I said, look, do you mind if I do something similar in Australia? And they said, of course you can. You're not going to compete with us. So copying the success of others is very important, surrounding yourself with capable people. I also loved radio, loved electronics, so it was a field that I loved. And as a kid, I used to go and buy components with my hard-earned money, so I was actually catering to those people. But the thing to remember, I never thought that I would become big in business. I saw a company called Howard Carr Radio at Chatswood. He had 3 people working for him. So when I started the business with $610, I said to my fiance Pip, look, we could have a business like that. Imagine 3 or 4 people working for us. Well, wouldn't that be fantastic? It was only when it got bigger and bigger, and the reason I sold it when it got to 50 shops and $50 million turnover, 500 staff is I didn't know everybody. Same with Australian Geographic. It got so big I didn't know everybody. So I like things that are not too big. I love a business where you're having a lot of fun. It needs to be disciplined and well run, but it needs to be enjoyable. It's interesting because now that everything is sort of pre-manufactured and it's so cheap, the day of the electronics hobbyist is moving, it's changing. But I'm quite proud to say that whereas Dick Smith Electronics has moved into more consumer goods, Gary Johnson, who was one of my right-hand men in Dick Smith Electronics, I can't say I trained him, we sort of trained each other as we grew the business. Ike Bain was incredibly important, but Gary went on, when he saw Dick Smith Electronics moving into consumer, he sort of took over the component side, and I know Gary, and he still uses the same formula that I originally used at Dick Smith Electronics. I buy most of my components there because he's taken over with that market. Now, I mean, he's very fortunate because he doesn't have much competition these days because the market has basically moved smaller. But if you look at his electronics catalogue, it's as good or probably better than we ever had in our day. So it's good to see that components are still available. So if you want to be an enthusiastic, you can still build things. I think that's most important. I've got grandchildren now, and they haven't yet, the eldest is 7, haven't yet really got into the electronics radio building. It'll be interesting to see because these days they have their iPod or their iPhone and it's just, you couldn't build one yourself. Now I'm going to try and enthuse them. I'm going to try and get them to build a crystal set like the very first crystal set I built. It'll be interesting to see whether they can actually do that because I wonder if the components will be available. Possibly they will be. I think getting a set of high impedance headphones is going to be hard, which is what you need. And these days, most people just buy things. It's sort of changed, and that's a pity, I think. But then again, that's life. I suppose back when I was young and building a crystal set and say using transistors for the first time, older people would have been saying, what's happened to the world? We have to use valves with high tension batteries and all of the costs and the problems involved. Australia, consumer-wise, I mean, the LCD TVs we buy are just incredibly high per capita in the world. Our electronics retailers are booming with their consumer goods, but there's no doubt that the hobbyist side has gone down. Amateur radio is a good example. Most of the ham radio experts, ham radio enthusiasts would build everything. I just recently went to the 100th anniversary of the Wireless Institute of Australia. Absolutely fantastic. Now, not that much is built. It's hard enough to buy some of the higher kilowatt components and so forth if you want to really put out a bit of signal. And also the equipment you can buy from Yaesu or someone like that is so fantastic. You could never make it as well. Back in my day, if you made something, it could quite often be better than anything you could buy, if indeed there was something available. But I think this is just life. Things change cyclically. And I wonder if, first of all, I understand the Funway books still sell. People are still interested. You still have to get that basic training. And I only hope that young people will have the fun of learning how to solder and learning how to build something which doesn't work and you have to try and fix it so it does work. What's a lot harder now, and everything with an advantage has a disadvantage. And to open up a business like Dick Smith Electronics today would be almost impossible. Globalization is so big from all around the world. So that's very difficult. And I think that's quite bad. I think our globalisation of big companies owning anything that's big has got the advantage that, generally speaking, prices have come down. But it's taken away the chance of a small business. Yes, you can run a small business in servicing, but to open up a retailer like Dick Smith Electronics or Tandy or Harvey Norman would be very difficult. The advantage is that sometimes businesses lose the track and they go broke, and that gives the advantage for someone else to open up. I'd rather see less of this huge globalisation, these huge big companies, and more allowing small businesses to start up and thrive. One of the questions I'm asked most often is, being in my position, being well off and having these material things, do I ever build things? Yes, I do. I love it. It's interesting because sometimes I go into the Dick Smith Electronics shop and I'm buying something and the young salesman is saying, sir, do you understand how this Zener diode works? And after a while, from his body language, I realise that he's thinking, oh, that looks like Dick Smith. And after a while he leaves me and I can see him talking to someone behind the counter and they're all looking at me. Is that Dick Smith? Finally they work out it is. So yes, I still build things. I love it. I've still got my soldering iron. I've still got my workshop. What was the last thing I built? It was a little timer. I've got a system where the gate opens and closes. I just have a sound alert that goes off. And I build simple things. I've actually got hidden for my grandchildren one of those old retro valve radios, or the Americans would say tube, and I don't know where I'm going to get the 67.5 volt B battery, or was it A battery? I can't remember. Maybe I'll make them up with little 9 volt batteries in series. But I'm going to sit down with my grandkids and we're going to build a radio like I did in 1952, using some old valves from battery valves, a headset and a regenerative receiver. Nowadays, of course, I suppose if you were going to build a radio, you just buy a little IC that does it anyway. The microcontroller, has it left people behind? Certainly left me behind, because when I make anything, I go back to basics. And recently I invented and designed a unit for Australian airports. Not many people know this, but We're one of the few countries that in country airports we don't have a radio operator called a unicom, which in America, England, it might be the refueler or someone at the airport to answer you when you give a call on the airport frequency to check your radio's working. So I invented a little gadget which receives your signal and transmits back to you. Firstly, it comes back and says the name of the airport, and then after that it gives a beep. So it's called a beep-back unit. So it means your transmitter's working, and it's to make something relatively fail-safe. Well, initially I went and bought, there was a little recorder with an IC in it, so I used that for recording. I put my voice on it, and then I think I did use a 555 timer to actually operate the thing with a relay. It was very basic. And I notice now that a new company is building those, and of course it's using all these new fandangled type devices which have taken away the old discrete device and the simple way of doing things. But someone old-fashioned like me, I mean, I'm lucky enough to be working with semiconductors. I'd almost like to go back to valves. It's a real pleasure, and isn't it fantastic that radio and electronics is still going ahead in Australia? And I used to be the young kid on the block, now I'm the old man.